Hey guys, so here's lesson 7 in our Earth and Climate unit. In this lesson, we're going to be studying, or we're focusing on how we are able to study what the climate was like before we started keeping hard data and statistical records, which we've really only been doing for the past couple hundred years or so. If you want to follow along in your textbook, we are in chapter 8.1. So, to make use of old data, we make use of what we call proxy records. And these help us answer the question, how do we know what happened before we started actively collecting data such as temperature, such as the amount of particular gases in the atmosphere. So we make use of what we call proxy records. These are stores of natural information that are indirect records of climate, and they can be measured to give clues about the past. So we're going to go through 3 different examples of common proxy records, and I would suggest that you make sure you know these 3 because a good exam question might be something along the lines of what are some ways in which we know the climate from before we started keeping records, and explain a couple of those ways of gathering data. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. Okay. The first proxy method is by taking a look at ice cores. This here is just the process of drilling out an ice core. So you can see it's quite long. This one looks like it's about maybe 7 feet long, maybe a little bit longer. So the picture on the left is the actual process of drilling, and the picture on the right is kind of a top or a side view of the ice core there. More interesting though is if we look at this ice core after it's kind of been processed and cleaned up. So for your notes, you should just note that ice cores, they can be cut into thin slices, and what we do is we analyze the air bubbles inside those slices. Now those air bubbles can be analyzed for 2 things. The first one is to measure the amount of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide in the air when the air bubbles are formed. So that's CO2, CH4, and N2O. The second thing that these ice cores can be used for is to determine the amount of oxygen, which can give us an indication about air temperature at the time. Okay. So if you take a look at the picture on the left, it's looking at it from the side of the picture. Well, looking at the ice core it was laying down. The picture on the right is a nice picture because you can actually see how the ice changes at each of these intervals. And if you remember To an Inconvenient Truth, when we were watching in class, Al Gore spoke about how you could visibly see the differences in these ice cores after particular kind of clean air laws were passed. So you can see there the cleanliness of the air and the water at different times. We know that during warm periods, the greenhouse gases are a little bit higher, and then cooler periods, the levels were lower. So we can equate the amount of greenhouse gases we find in these ice cores with the surrounding temperature. The second proxy method is tree rings. So we know, or you should know by now, that if you count the rings on a tree, you can tell how old it is, with each ring corresponding to 1 year. But what you might not know is that the spaces between the rings can actually give you a better picture of the environment around the tree at any given point in time. So the left picture is just a cross-section of a tree. You can see the rings there, and it doesn't tell you a whole lot, but if you dig deep and you look at the picture on the right, each of those kind of dark brown lines in the blown up picture represent 1 ring. And what we want to look at is the space between the annual rings. So in a kind of a warm, wet year, we'll produce thick tree rings. So I guess we should say, the space between the lines. And then whereas cold, dry years will produce thin rings. Also, interestingly enough, coral reefs kind of grow the same way that trees do, like one layer is added on every year. So you can see the same pattern happening in coral reefs. Rings for living and dead trees can provide climate data as far back as 10,000 years. So trees can be around for a while. So what you want to look at here, and I hope you can see my mouse on the screencast. If you take a look at this distance between these two curves here, this is indicating to us that these were favorable growing conditions. When we have larger spaces, we're looking at good growing conditions. Smaller spaces are telling us that it's harsher growing conditions. So if you look here, this is the outside bark of a tree. You got to look for the tree kind of up top. This is the middle of the tree, and we're moving outwards. So these lines down here came up first, and these ones came up a little bit later. So this gives us an indication of whether the climate was a good climate for a tree or a bad growing climate for a tree. And then because we know what the type of tree is and what climates it prefers, it gives us an indication of what the climate might have been like. So we know that if a particular tree prefers a warm, wet climate, we will see more rings like this. The last proxy record is rock and ocean sediment, so kind of the sand you find at the bottom of an ocean or something. We know that layers of soil and rock, they build up over time, not with as much consistency necessarily as tree rings, but they build up over time on the Earth's surface, and layers of sediment form layers of rock on the bottom of the ocean floor. Now these layers can give us different clues. We can look at fossils of pollen grains to identify what plants were growing at any given point in time. This gives us an indication about the temperature, because we know that different plants, different sea life, for example, may grow at different temperatures. They can give us clues as to the fossils of marine plants and animals, and they can also give us an idea of the amount of precipitation that happens. So when we have thicker layers of mud on rock sediment, for example, we will be able to equate that with more rain, which kind of wash the soil into the body of water. So if we see, more or thicker layers of mud at the bottom of the ocean or near the coastline, for example, we can attribute that to runoff from the land into the water due to rain. So that's it for this one. This was a relatively short lesson. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments or ask me in class.